In 1974, on a warm afternoon in Pasadena, one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century walked onto a stage at the California Institute of Technology and delivered a warning. He was Richard Feynman, Nobel laureate, the man who had helped build the atomic bomb at Los Alamos when he was barely out of his 20s. The physicist who would, a decade later, expose the cause of the Challenger space shuttle disaster on national television with nothing but a glass of ice water and a small piece of rubber. And on that afternoon, in front of a graduating class that had no idea what was about to happen, he gave a speech so quietly devastating that scientists, philosophers, and journalists are still arguing about it more than 50 years later. The speech was called Cargo Cult Science. Most people remember the metaphor. Almost nobody talks about what it really meant. And once you see what Feynman was actually warning us about, you cannot unsee it. To understand why this speech still matters, you need to understand the strange image at its centre. During the Second World War, American and Japanese forces moved through the islands of the South Pacific. They built airstrips, set up radio towers, and brought with them an almost unimaginable abundance of cargo. Tinned food, machinery, medicine, clothes, tools. To the islanders watching from the jungle, it looked like magic. Tall men in uniforms walked onto a flat stretch of land, spoke into strange boxes, waved lights, and out of the sky came riches. Then the war ended. The soldiers left, the cargo stopped, and in the years that followed, on islands across Melanesia, something remarkable happened. The islanders began to recreate, in painstaking detail, the rituals they had seen. They cleared runways out of the bush. They lit fires along the edges of the strips at night. They built control towers out of bamboo. They carved wooden headphones and put them on a man who would sit in the tower and speak into a wooden microphone. They were not stupid. They were trying to reason backwards from effect to cause. They had seen the form. They had memorized the form perfectly. They were doing everything right. But the planes did not come. This is the image Feynman planted in the minds of his graduating class. Then he turned it on the people sitting in front of him. He said, more or less, that there are entire fields of modern research that look exactly like this. They follow the apparent precepts and forms of scientific investigation. They use statistics, they publish papers, they run conferences, they wear the lab coats, and they cite the right journals. The form is perfect. It looks exactly like science. But the planes are not landing. New treatments are not appearing. Crime is not decreasing, despite endless theory about how to handle criminals. Children are not learning to read better, despite generations of educational research. Something essential is missing. And then he asked the question almost no one wants to ask in public. What is the missing thing? His answer is the part of the speech that stings. He said, the missing thing is a particular kind of scientific integrity. Not the kind you learn in a textbook. Not honesty in the ordinary sense of not telling lies. He called it a kind of utter honesty, a practice of leaning over backwards to publish every reason your own conclusion might be wrong. If you do an experiment, he said, you should report not only what supports your theory, but every alternative explanation you considered, and every flaw you suspect in your own method. You should hand the next researcher every weapon they could possibly use against you. Because the first principle, the one he repeated and underlined and built the entire speech around, is this. You must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. Now here is where almost every retelling of this speech stops. People quote that line, they put it on posters, they tweet it, and they miss the disturbing implication that follows from it. The implication that nobody seems to want to talk about. Because if Feynman is right, if the easiest person to fool is yourself, then the danger he is describing is not coming from the obvious cranks. It is not coming from the astrologers and the UFO hunters and the homeopaths he mentioned almost in passing. Those are easy targets. They were easy targets in 1974, and they are easy targets now. The real danger Feynman is pointing at, very carefully, very politely, is coming from inside the building. It is coming from researchers with proper credentials in respected universities, publishing in prestigious journals, who have built entire careers on results that may not be true. The cargo cult scientist, in Feynman's vision, is not the witch doctor. The cargo cult scientist is the colleague down the hall. This is the implication that almost nobody talked about for decades. And then, slowly, beginning in the 2010s, the scientific community started to talk about it under a different name. They called it the replication crisis. Researchers attempted to redo famous studies, often in psychology, sometimes in medicine, sometimes in nutrition, sometimes in economics. Study after study refused to replicate. Findings that had appeared in textbooks, that had shaped public policy, that had launched best-selling books and entire industries of self-help and management consulting simply could not be reproduced when other laboratories tried. The numbers vary by field. In some areas of social psychology, more than half of the landmark studies of an entire generation failed independent replication. In preclinical cancer research, the failure rates have been reported as even worse. We do not have to argue about the exact percentage. The pattern is undeniable. Large parts of modern science have been building runways out of bamboo and lighting fires along the edges, and the planes have not been landing. What makes this so unsettling is that Feynman saw it coming half a century before the crisis was officially named. He even gave specific examples of how it would happen. He told the story of Robert Millikan's famous oil drop experiment, the one that measured the charge of the electron and won a Nobel Prize. Millikan got an answer that was slightly wrong because he had used the wrong value for the viscosity of air. After Millikan, when other physicists measured the charge, they kept getting numbers that were slightly larger than his. But instead of publishing the corrected number boldly, many of them assumed they had made a mistake and quietly adjusted their results closer to Millikan's. The true value drifted upward over decades, one cautious paper at a time, until the field finally accepted the real number. Feynman used this story to make a point that is almost unbearable to think about. Even physicists, working in the hardest of the hard sciences, surrounded by other physicists who genuinely believed in honesty, had unconsciously bent their data to match the answer of a famous man. They were not lying, they were fooling themselves. They were the easiest people in the world to fool. If that can happen in a physics lab, measuring the charge on an electron, what do you imagine is happening in a field that studies something fuzzier, like the effect of a certain teaching method on reading scores, or the effect of a small monetary incentive on human behaviour, or the effect of a particular diet on long-term health? The honest answer is that we already know. Feynman told us in 1974. The replication crisis confirmed it 40 years later. And the system that produced it is still very much in place. Why does it persist? This is where Feynman ended his speech, and this is where the warning becomes personal. He told his graduating students that the integrity he was describing is hard. It is hard because it requires you to publish things that work against your own career. It is hard because journals prefer dramatic positive results, not careful negative ones. It is hard because grants flow toward novelty, not toward replication. It is hard because your reputation, your funding, your salary, your sense of self, all depend on you being right in public. And the easiest way to be right in public is to quietly stop looking too closely at whether you are right in private. Feynman ended his speech with a wish for his students. He wished them the good luck to be somewhere where they could afford to keep their integrity. He wished them the freedom not to need to fool themselves. Listen to that wish carefully, because it tells you what he believed the alternative would be. He believed that for most working scientists, in most working institutions, that freedom would be slowly taken away. So what do we do with all of this? The point of this video is not to attack science. Feynman loved science. He believed it was the most beautiful and honest thing humans had ever built. The point is to recognise that real science is not the lab coat and the citation and the press release. Real science is the practice of leaning over backwards to disprove yourself. And it is rare, and it is fragile, and it can be replaced very easily by a cargo cult that looks exactly like the real thing. When you read a headline that begins with the word studies, when a confident expert tells you that the science is settled, when a new diet or therapy or educational intervention is announced as a breakthrough, the question Feynman wants you to ask is not whether the form is correct. The form is almost always correct. The question is whether the planes are actually landing. He wanted his graduating students to ask that question for the rest of their lives. He wanted them to ask it of their own work first and of the work of others second. He wanted them to fear self-deception more than they feared being wrong, because being wrong is correctable and self-deception is not. And he wanted us, the people who would inherit the institutions they were about to enter, to remember the warning long after the speech was over. Half a century later, the replication crisis has named what he saw. The disturbing implication is not that some people do bad science. The disturbing implication is that the structure of modern research can quietly turn good people into cargo cult priests, sincere and credentialed and completely unaware that no aeroplane is going to land on the runway they have built. Feynman knew this in 1974. He told us as gently as he could, and he hoped that at least a few of the young people in front of him would carry the warning forward and refuse, in their own small corner of the scientific world, to fool themselves. That is the part of the speech almost nobody talks about. That is the part that should keep you up at night. And that is the part, more than 50 years later, that we are finally being forced to confront. If this video gave you something worth thinking about, leave a comment and tell me where you see cargo cult thinking in the world today. Subscribe for more deep dives into the ideas that shaped modern physics and the people who tried to keep it honest. And remember the first principle, the one Feynman never stopped repeating. You must not fool yourself. And you are the easiest person to fool.